Despite investing over $12 billion federally on top of individual state funding, the research for children who are in foster care in America are grim. Less than half the kids who at any point enter the system will go on to graduate high school, with less than 10% of them going on to obtain any sort of higher education, with only 6% of them achieving a bachelor's degree or higher. Half of them will develop substance addiction problems, with 47% of them struggling with unemployment and 30% of them facing homelessness. It's clear that systemically we're not doing enough to prepare these children and get them ready for the world. But how did we get here, and why is the system failing all these children? And most importantly, what can we do to fix this?
And the state is losing foster families.
There's only 50 foster families for 90 children.
Agencies asking for urgency.
The system is putting them at further risk.
Alright, so how did we even get here in the first place? Let's briefly look over the history. In 1853, Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society, which took homeless kids in cities and sent them to rural families across America, famously by train. This was the first very centralized attempt in our nation's history to really help out children in a bad situation. Then throughout the rest of the century there was a widespread establishment of state-run orphanages to house kids in need. However, these were poorly run and had terrible conditions that really didn't care much for the child whatsoever. Up until this point, the idea with these state-run orphanages was just to take these kids and place them somewhere else where they could ideally be taken care of. Then in 1909, the White House officially placed out a memo in which Theodore Roosevelt personally endorsed home placements over the previously run orphanages. While this in itself didn't really do anything, it began a stepping stone away from orphanages towards the foster care system we know today. Then in 1935, the Social Security Act was signed, and with it, it created funding for child welfare services to help states expand their programs. This was the first definitive step towards the program that we know today. The idea with foster care was that by placing distraught children in a comfortable, familiar environment, it would help them develop and transform into functioning adults. And since then, the system as we've known it has transpired into place. And although there have been some acts of reform such as the 1974 Child Abuse Treatment Act, which mandated states to track and investigate child abuse cases, the system as we know it has shown to have a lot of problems which really unveiled over the decades. Okay, so there are two main aspects we need to focus on here. First, the individual problems within the system, and second, the overall strain on the system that prevents it from working well in the first place. To begin, across all 50 states and agencies, the primary goal of foster care is the reunification of families, and while this can seem like a good thing, like for instance an alcoholic parent only being able to reconnect with their child after going through treatment and rehab, this can place the child under further abuse. For instance, one study found that nearly a quarter of all children who are reunified with their original families are re-reported to CPS, with ultimately 16% of them re-entering the system at some point. Now, this isn't to say that reunification shouldn't be a goal. In fact, youth of color are disproportionately sent into the system because of underlying problems such as poverty and drug use. In many cases, reunification is truly the best thing for the child. However, it's clear that our current system needs to do more to make sure that reunification is done safely. Another problem we need to look at are reports of abuse when the child is placed within the system. Now, official statistics report that only around 2% of children experience maltreatment, which doesn't seem that high. However, so many cases go unreported that some studies estimate that upwards of 40% of children face abuse. Additionally, children are at much greater risk of being sexually abused. For instance, one study on a group of girls found that 81% of them were SA'd, and although that study was done on a limited number, it demonstrates just how prevalent abuse truly is in the system, and the scary part is we don't have the capacity to truly quantify just how widespread it actually is. U.S. Senator Ron Wyden said that the ultimate indictment of the system is that there is so little oversight that the government can't even confirm the gaps that caring advocates tell us are getting worse. We just don't even have the tools in place to truly capture or get accurate data on this. Many of these children have faced severe trauma, and over half of them have some form of mental illness. It's well known that when children are abused, their outcomes in life are much more grim. Yet for foster care children who's already experienced a tremendous amount of prior abuse, when they're further abused within the system, it not only exacerbates their pre-existing problems, but makes it much harder for them to succeed later in life. The system simply does not do enough to keep these children safe and prevent abuse inside and outside their original homes. And in doing so, it actively perpetuates a cycle of trauma, neglect, and instability, which stays with these children later in their life and prevents them from becoming thriving, functioning adults. Now, to understand why the system is failing, we first need to look at its shortcomings to understand why it is the way it is. Now, for context, we need to understand that foster care, while federally supported, is run state by state, and each state runs their own programs differently. Under the U.S. Constitution, the states are considered to bear the primary responsibility for ensuring the well-being of children and their families. 51% of foster care is supported by the states, with 49% being supported by the federal government, such as funding allocated through the Social Security Act or other grants. And on top of federal funding, as I mentioned, each state individually supports their own programs. And in total, states have spent about $34 billion. However, each state spends a different amount of money. Here is a graph showing the proportion states spend on childcare in relation to their federal funding. Some states, like Delaware, fund their child welfare programs with 83% of their own spending, whereas states like Louisiana are spending only 22% of their own money. This means for states like Louisiana, they are mainly reliant on whatever portion of the $12 billion they get. Now, I want to show you another graph which ranks all 50 states based on quality of child welfare, and I want you to notice that there seems to be a strong correlation between states that spend more on their foster care programs and how well that state is ranked in terms of child welfare as a whole. For instance, Massachusetts and Maine are considered to be some of the best in the nation. Now, this disparity leads to varying experiences across the system. Also, a lot of cases are being overrun by casework and the amount of cases filed. One report finds that the turnover rate for state social workers is between 23% and 60%. This is a field that is very emotionally demanding and where it's also very common to be overworked and underpaid. These turnouts are plaguing child services since it increases the casework for the people who stay, and in doing so it increases the processing times and creates a long backlog of problems. Additionally, social workers aren't easy to replace either. They work in a very sensitive field that requires a lot of training, and most states require that social workers obtain a master's degree to even work. One source outlines that each social worker who leaves costs the agency an estimated $54,000. This problem is most noticeable in states that don't invest much into their own programs. All of this leads to inefficiency, with long wait times for children to get into the system and a harder time navigating once they're in. This is why abuse is so common in the system and why it goes so unreported. States simply don't have the mechanisms to safely ensure and check in on the child. To deal with this strain, 28 states are allowing for some degree of for-profit contracting of foster care services to help facilitate the placement of children. Yet there's a problem, because when profit is the number one concern, children are left neglected. At one private facility in Michigan, a teenager died after being violently restrained for just throwing a sandwich. These aren't isolated incidents either, as an investigation led by Senators Ron Wyden and Orrin Hatch found that, by and large, children who are under the legal authority of their state yet receive services from private, for-profit agencies have been abused, neglected, and denied service. In essence, the reason the system is failing is because it's not even designed in a way to ensure long-term success for children, and the solutions that some states are turning to only leaves them more vulnerable. It's very clear that the current system in America is failing. Things have to change if we want to see improvement. The United States should be doing better to not only prevent abuses from happening to foster care children, but to ensure that they have the tools needed to thrive as functioning adults. Our system needs reforms, and one way to go about that would be to increase the funding for state social and caseworkers. This would not only give them the money that they deserve, but it would help prevent burnout and in doing so ultimately lower the turnout rate. This would help increase the overall efficiency of the system by ensuring each child receives more proper attention and care. With greater funding, states wouldn't have to turn to for-profit contractors to extend services and could instead help children navigate the system more efficiently and prevent abuses. Here's the thing though, it's not feasible for all states to increase their proportion of spending since they may not have as much money due to budget constraints, competing priorities like education and healthcare, and ultimately varying tax revenues. Poorer states, particularly those with lower GDPs, have higher reliance on federal funding and may struggle to allocate additional resources to foster care without federal help. And this is why we have disparities in the nation in the quality of care and services for foster care, with some children in some areas being more vulnerable than in others. A potential solution to this would be more centralization and increased federal spending, especially for states that are doing poorly when it comes to providing these services. This would help alleviate disparities across the nation. Additionally, with more federal oversight, we would have more accurate reporting and data tracking, so we can actually see what goes on in the system and have a more accurate count of abuse instances. When it comes to something as sensitive as child abuse and neglect, the problems and solutions are often very complicated, but since our current maltreatment data tracking is so poor, we don't even really know where to begin. At the end of the day, foster care shouldn't just be a political issue. At its heart, it's a human one. Every child deserves a safe home, stability, and a real chance at success. The United States isn't doing enough whatsoever to ensure any of that, and too many children are simply falling through the system and suffering. Yet all of that can change. All it takes is reform and commitment. Thank you for watching.
It was harder until I started to accept that I wasn't going to be adopted. I wasn't going to find, biological family and live with them. Today, in many states,